Thank you for listening to the Who's Flying the Plane podcast. I'm Alex, and you'll hear me interviewing creative people about their influences, careers, and work. This week, I'm talking to Joe Wells, a comedian and writer whose first book dealt with his experiences with OCD. We talk about his upcoming book, which focuses on the positive aspects of being autistic, his own experiences with autism since he's had an autism diagnosis, and his comedy career so far. Maybe you could start by telling me what it was that made you think, I want to write, I want to be a comedian. Which of those came first? And how did you first get your start in those worlds?
Well, I guess writing funny. So when I was at school, I found it very hard to make friends and didn't fit in. I think... But then I started writing like funny stories and little essays and things. And I would persuade this was just so... It's so weird how, in a way, how shy I was, how I had like very low self-esteem, but also I had the confidence to write like a humorous essay and then persuade the teacher that I should be allowed to read out in front of the class at the end of the lesson. So yeah, I'd write like little funny things and the teachers would sometimes let me read them out in front of the class. And then I wrote a book when I was 15. I had very bad... OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, as a teenager. So then I wrote, when that was starting to get better, I wrote a book about my experience of that and of cognitive behavioral therapy. So that was kind of I got quite lucky when I was a teenager because I got this kind of big break into writing where there weren't many books written by young people about mental health. So so I was able to get this book published when I was so it would have come out when I just turned 17, but I wrote it when I was 15, about experiences of the past kind of between 8 and 15. So yeah, and that book I had, it wasn't a comedy book, but it had funny bits in it, and one of the things which people liked about it was that it had a kind of light-hearted approach, had some kind of funny cartoons and stuff like that in it. And then I'd seen like a few comedians. I saw Ross Noble, who I was just blown away by Ross Noble, and I think I didn't know any. I think he is brilliant anyway. But I think when you kind of go into it without knowing anything about comedy, and once you know a bit about comedy, you can see a little bit of the joins of the improv stuff that he does. He's still incredible, and his genius is how he can sew material into improvised bits. But there's one of the first comedians I saw that this guy just making everything up on the spot as far as I was concerned. It just completely blew me away. And then I saw Mark Thomas, who's a very different kind of storytelling comedian. And then I started to watch different people. I was watching a lot of TV comedy, and it was when the internet was kind of like dial-up internet. So there was a show called The World Stands Up. I remember seeing little clips of people like, I think Josh Howie was on it, and Milton Jones, and people like that, who I guess were kind of at the time doing the kind of comedy club circuit. So now I was just deciding, that's what I'll do. I think I had that confidence of like that very lucky situation when I was 15. I went, I'm going to write a book, and somehow that happened and the book got published. So I just had this huge kind of, I guess this huge ego as a teenager where I was like, well, I'll do that. And I went, oh yeah, I'll be a comedian. And I thought I would just walk into just doing my own shows. I didn't realise it would be a longer walk to be able to do it professionally.
Yeah, the book you mentioned writing, which I had no idea you were only 15 when you wrote it, is called Touch and Go Joe. And
yes,
I think it's pretty amazing. I'm learning as you're telling me that you were 50 when you wrote it, so that was a bit of a shock for me because it's been very well received and things like that. So what's something that you really appreciated hearing back from someone who's read it? Is there some sort of response to it that really made it all worthwhile, or what were you sort of expecting to do with that book?
Yeah, I think I still occasionally do get kind of emails and things saying, it made me realise that I wasn't the only one. I think that's the kind of main thing which I hear from people, and which I think is, which is nice to hear, is that it made people feel not alone. Because I think when I was going through having OCD and going through CBT, I thought, certainly before I had any diagnosis, I didn't even know it was a thing, and I think the mental health conversation is in a different place now to what it was, I'm talking about the early noughties, which isn't that long ago, but it's easy to forget how different the mental health conversation was there. No one talked about mental health. That your understanding of mental health came from watching horror films where people heard voices in their head telling them to kill people, and then they went and killed people. That was what mental health was.
Yeah.
And I knew that wasn't what I was experiencing. I was experiencing worries and things which I knew to some extent were normal, kind of going into a sort of problematic place. So I can't, certainly before I had that diagnosis or had that kind of education about mental health from a therapist, I had no idea of this being. So I remember going to the first therapy session and part of me's thinking, oh God, part of me's thinking they think I'm crazy and they're going to lock me up and that, and I'm going to be put in a straitjacket. And then another part of me's thinking, I'm not really mentally ill, because mental illness is is only about hearing voices and only what I've seen in kind of problematic horror films, So I'm going into that going, they're going to find out that I'm kind of faking this whole thing, because really what's happening is I'm just worrying about stuff, and that's not mental illness. So that was a difficult part of it, and certainly delayed me getting any help and allowed things to get a lot worse because I didn't have that understanding of what it was like. That's what I hear. What I get from a lot of people, the nice feedback I get is it made me realize I wasn't alone, and I think that's what I had to offer. And I think even when I was a teenager, I was quite aware of that was what I had to kind of bring to the table. I wasn't a mental health expert, but what I had was insight into what an intrusive thought feels like, and what it's like showing up at the doctors and them kind of asking weird questions, what it's like trying to explain things to your parents and them not understanding at first.
I think that's great, and I think with all of the change around the way we see mental health at the moment, I found it quite easy to think that I have got that covered now. I feel like I know if a friend says to me, oh, I'm depressed or anxious or something, I feel like, okay, well, I know a little bit about how to treat you or how to respect that or that kind of thing. But I realised just a few months ago, I met someone who has a form of OCD, and it's nothing like what yours seems to be like. You mentioned intrusive thoughts there, and I think that is something they experience, but there's nothing like OCD. People think of turning things off and on a certain number of times and that kind of thing, but this person is suffering with it purely mentally. It's just to do with thoughts and stuck thoughts and repetition in your mind and that kind of thing. There's never too much to learn about that kind of thing, and the fact that you're writing from lived experience instead of some sort of documentary talking about this is what OCD looks like, I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, I do think, and this is also something which I did kind of worked part-time in a job which touched on this. I think that you hear a lot of discussion around lived experience or lived expertise at the moment, and I think it's become a bit of a buzzword, and I think sometimes there's or buzz phrase, there's a kind of misunderstanding about it, where I think that people feel that lived expertise is saying the only experts in this thing are people who have lived through it. And for me, certainly around, I would talk my kind of experiences around mental health and neurodivergence. I think that for me, lived expertise is about there's a specific type of expertise that only this group has. Do you know what I mean? An analogy which a friend of mine used, which I think is really helpful, is about if you want to understand a mountain, then you could ask a geologist and they would explain how all the rocks form, or you could ask different people, and they could kind of, meteorologists could explain why there's snow at the top because of the weather and that sort of thing. But if you want to know what it's like to be at the top of the mountain, look out, and what that feels like, then you'd have to ask someone who has a kind of lived experience of the mountain. And I think that's I feel like that's a helpful way to think about lived experience. It's not to say it's the only expertise, but it's a specific type of expertise that no one else can have. You can't train for it. You can't even if you study, you can't kind of directly have that expertise, if that makes sense.
Would it be safe to assume that you learnt about the problem that you were suffering with through talking to people who'd never had it? If you're talking to doctors and therapists, would it be fair to assume that you learned about your own condition from them?
Yeah, I think, certainly the people who I assume, that's an assumption I made about those people, so I don't know what what their private experiences were, but how the clinicians I worked with, I guess the expertise they came into those sessions with was clinical expertise. They certainly didn't bring their lived expertise in, but it's very possible that they may have had some lived expertise as well, but that wasn't what they kind of brought to the session, if that makes sense.
I watched one of your stand-up clips, and it took a really different tone to some other ones, because you go from being quite a politically focused comedian, and then suddenly you were talking about your recent, as in sort of 2 years ago, I think, autism diagnosis. And that's another thing that's obviously, you're talking about neurodivergence there. And I thought it was really interesting that it sort of, once you've got that label applied to you, it completely, it made you really overanalyze things that had happened in your past. And the piece of material was talking about an experience that you had, and how, had you known, or you were trying to work out if had you known that you were autistic at the time, then you might have framed that differently. But I wanted to know, do you find that diagnosis changes how you approach things going forward? Are you sort of thinking about situations differently now? Has that changed how you approach your life very much, or is it just an answer to a question?
Yeah, no, I think it has it definitely has changed how I kind of approach things. I think that I'm more confident asking for things to be. I think that before you have before I had a diagnosis, there were lots of things which I'd be rubbish at, and I didn't know why. So I think I always had that lingering sense of don't ask for help. You should be able to do this, and yeah. So I feel like in a way it's given me a confidence to go, these are things that I'm good at, and I'm going to ask for help for the things I'm not good at. Yeah, so I think that's one way it's kind of changed my approach to things. I think it's less the diagnosis. I think it's that idea of through speaking to other neurodivergent people, that idea that of just trying to flip what is normal and trying to think, am I wrong here? Am I getting things wrong? Or is it just that there's an expectation on me to be a certain way, and that I think has informed how I approach things.
What was it that made you go and get the test to find out that you were autistic? Because it's quite late in life, or at least in my opinion. I think of
this
children being
diagnosed. It's an interesting
diagnosed.
story, because my mum gave me a lift in her car 4 years ago, and as I was getting out of the car, very casually she said to me, "Oh, have I ever mentioned to you that you're autistic?" And she hadn't mentioned that to me before. When I've been going through the CBT and therapy, it was suggested that I be put forward for a diagnosis, and I've now kind of had access to I had access before, but I've now looked at the notes from that time, and they're talking about they use the term Asperger's syndrome at the time. the two versions. So I don't have recollection of this. My mum swears this is what happened. Is that they suggested being put forward for the diagnosis to me, and I said I didn't want the diagnosis. I don't remember that, but that doesn't surprise me. I think that, again, it's like how the mental health conversation has changed. When I look back at those notes, the description of autistic traits to me in those notes seems very, very negative, and I think that what we're talking about almost 20 years ago now, the only model, I mean, there were progressive conversations happening, but they weren't reaching kind of mainstream therapies. But the only kind of model which was known about of what it is to be autistic was a kind of deficit model, that there's something wrong with you. So I think that's why I would have resisted it. So yeah, when I kind of found that out, I then sought the formal diagnosis as an adult. So I would have been 29. Was it the year that I did? Yeah, I would have been 29, I think, when I had the formal diagnosis. Which I saw as an adult. But as I should, my mum was also running. The weird story is my mum ran this support group for parents of autistic children, and I kind of knew about it, but I just never put the two together. So she was kind of doing stuff and going to sessions to learning how to support an autistic child, but without the formal diagnosis. So yeah, it was a weird thing to discover, and to kind of think, oh yeah, it was something which was kind of referred to euphemistically when I was growing up as well, but I just never really thought about what it meant when that was being referred to.
Do you think your mum didn't want to label you with that because she had the deficit theory as well, that would be something like a bit of a burden to you?
I think my mum was, in a way, very progressive on this stuff for the time. So one of the things I found out is that when she ran this group, they were doing a stand at some kind of event, and what other people wanted to do was to have how bad autism is, and she insisted on having she wanted every parent to write about the strengths of their child and what their child is good at, and that be how autism is presented. But I still think there was that, that kind of deficit model was all that was around then. I think that, I don't know. It's it's a strange thing, and I think that I would have been resistant to it as well. So I think that, I probably wouldn't have wanted to have that label anyway.
If you go over to the Who's Flying the Plane YouTube channel, you can watch the latest episodes of In the Studio, our video series talking to artists and creatives about their craft and showing the environments they work in. All of Series 1 is now available to watch, and the first episode of Series 2 is available now. And if you keep an eye out, they'll be uploaded every other Friday. So just go onto YouTube and search for Who's Flying the Plane, or you can follow the link in the description for this episode. So since you've had this diagnosis, you've become much more vocal about your own experience, and you're also working currently on a book about 30 neurodivergent people. Would you like to tell me a little bit about that book and what we'd get from reading it?
Yeah, so it's a young adult book, but I think one of the things which I think is interesting is how a lot of the ideas around neurodiversity are still just reaching professionals, really, and I think it's a strange situation where you have this kind of social movement of neurodivergent people, but it seems in some ways it can feel quite disconnected when you see autism researchers and stuff like that saying stuff which, to me, as someone who's kind of quite in the loop with a lot of the conversations around neurodiversity, often you will see someone whose job it is to, work with autistic young people or whatever, and the way they would talk about autism is, to me, feels quite old-fashioned. So it is a young adult book, but I hope that other people, that older adults, will read it as well. It's a book about 30 different neurodivergent people who I think have done cool and interesting things, and some of them are people who I was able to interview, and some people who I've written about through research. I think one of the things which I think was interesting was when I first pitched the book, I kind of said I want the angle of this to be that these people's, them being different is the thing that has made them brilliant and interesting, and that would be the kind of angle, that they've achieved cool things not in spite of being different, but because they are different. And the more I read people's work and read about people and spoke to people, the more clear that angle became. And I think so one of the people I interviewed was a guy called Warren Fried, who is the founder of Dyspraxia USA, and he talked about dyspraxia and determination, and the idea that when a lot of kind of physical things, it will take him multiple attempts to master them, in terms of working the washing machine and stuff like that. It might take him 10, 20 times to work out how to work this washing machine, but he will get there eventually. And that difference has instilled incredible determination in him. And I think that's really evident in his life story, because when he set up this organisation, fairly early on, he put on a meet and greet event for dyspraxic people to come together and meet each other, invites the local press, and no one shows up. And there's a brilliant news article where the newspaper have interviewed him on this day where no one's shown up, and the quote he gives to the newspaper is something like, we're going to do more and people are going to come in the future. And it's really kind of determined and sounds kind of from the outside, it almost looks slightly delusional, like he thinks that he hasn't lost any confidence from this event where no one's shown up. But then he just kept going and built this organisation, and then he does have meet and greets where people do come, and it builds and builds and builds. It was really clear to me that kind of that association of determination and dyspraxia comes through really clearly in Warren's life. And there were multiple people who I've written about where I think that Greta Thunberg's like a really obvious example, of someone who is very rigid in the way that they think, but actually that's what makes her a great campaigner, is that she's gone, well, the planet is dying if we don't do something about it, so we should all do something about it. And that, to me, is a very autistic way of thinking, and that is what we need, because if we don't have people who are rigidly going, yeah, we've got to save the environment or we're all going to die, then we're in trouble. So I think that there's lots of examples which came through when I was writing about people of going, you can see why. I really saw that different, having an unusual brain, certainly having diversity in the way that our brains are in society is useful, and if we try to get everyone to have the same type of brain, then we're going to lose out on some very important people who think differently. That's the kind of I hope that's the kind of message that comes through in the book, because that was what I took away from reading about and talking to these people.
Okay, Joe, what would you like to offer up as your Who's Flying the Plane hidden gem?
My first response when you asked me this was because I'm a massive hip hop fan, and I'm on a kind of constant quest to convert people to hip hop music. So my first thought was To Pimp a Butterfly, the Kendrick Lamar album, which I think is an absolute masterpiece of just writing and of structuring a thing. I think it is the best thing ever made. I don't know how much I've taken from that in my own work. I think that the thing which I probably, in terms of comedy writing, which I always recommend for people. It's kind of my you have like a go-to present for people. Is a copy of Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. So I think it's just such a great piece of comedy writing, such a clever book, such an unpretentious book as well. He's not trying to show off and be highbrow. There's a bit kind of a chapter or two in where he says, I can't be bothered to write anything clever. I'm just going to draw a picture of an arsehole. And then in the book, there's just like an asterisk of someone's bumhole. So I think Breakfast of Champions is a really if you are interested in comedy writing. I think Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut, which maybe isn't a hidden gem because he is very popular, but not enough people know about. I don't think enough people have read that book because not everyone has read that book.
So finally, Joe, please could you tell us how we keep up to date with what you do, where we can see you on tour soon, and also when your book is coming out?
So I'm on various social medias. I'm Joe Wells Comic on most of them, apart from Instagram, where I'm Joe Wells Comedian. I think I was Joe Wells Comic, but I locked myself out of my Instagram account, so I had to start a new one. And I've got a website, joewells.org.uk. My new book will be out May 19th, if everything goes to plan, 2022. It's called Wired Differently, 30 Neurodivergent People Who You Should Know.
Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to me, Joe.
Thank you.